I often refer to Chancellor Bob Hemingway as the best friend of the Dole Institute of Politics. The Chancellor convinced Senator Dole to locate the Institute at the University of Kansas and provides an enormous amount of support and encouragement for our programs. The Chancellor has also been instrumental in expanding and formalizing the relationship between the University and Fort Leavenworth. It's therefore fitting that he should have the honor of introducing tonight's guest. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Bob Hemingway.
Thank you very much, Bill. I can't help but as I look out and see this great scene that I regret that Senator Dole is not here tonight and see what his institute has brought the university. This is a very special night, and we have a very special speaker. And I'm going to share some of the official biography with you. Some of you may have read that from the program, but I think it bears repeating. It's a great honor to introduce Lieutenant General David Petraeus, Commanding General of the Combined Arms Center, headquartered, as you know, at Fort Leavenworth. General Petraeus oversees the Command and General Staff College and 17 other schools, centers, and training programs located throughout the United States, including the Army's Call Center, Center for Army Lessons Learned. General Petraeus is a distinguished and experienced leader. He served for over 15 months as the first commander of the Multinational Security Transition Command in Iraq and as the first commander of the NATO training mission in Iraq. Prior to that, General Petraeus commanded the 101st Airborne Division for nearly 2 years, leading the Screaming Eagles in combat during the first year of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Prior to his service in Iraq, he was deployed in Bosnia, where he was the Assistant Chief of Staff for Operations of the NATO Stabilization Force and Deputy Commander of the U.S. Joint Interagency Counterterrorism Task Force. He served as the aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army, military assistant to the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, served as a battalion, brigade, and divisions operations officer. He was Chief of Operations for the UN force in Haiti, and executive officer for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Petraeus is a graduate of the United States Military Academy, where he later served as assistant professor of international relations after earning master's and PhD degrees from Princeton. He's received the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Distinguished Service Medal, the Bronze Star Medal for Valor, the Gold Award of the Iraqi Order of the Date Palm, and the State Department's Superior Honor Award. He's a master parachutist, an air assault and ranger qualified. He's also earned the Combat Action Badge and French, German, and British jump wings. Earned, I presume, not on the same jump. In the fall of 2005, he was recognized by the United States News and World Report as one of America's 25 best leaders. We're indeed honored by his presence tonight at the Dole Institute and by his leadership for our country. David Petraeus is a very special person, as you're going to discover very quickly, and it's a great, great honor to have him at the university. General David Petraeus. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Chancellor. And I do want to assure all of you that did not earn all 3 different countries jump wings on one jump. It is great to be back in Lawrence. It's great to be in Jayhawk country this evening. You all very much honor me with your presence tonight. In fact, at dinner, I'd meant to share a story with the Chancellor about a particularly savvy Jayhawk that I observed a few years back, but time was running late, and so I figured I'd just go ahead and share it with all of you tonight. It goes like this. Some 20 years ago, when I was last assigned in Kansas at Fort Leavenworth at the Command and General Staff College as a student, I used to launch out on weekends and discover new running routes. And having explored many of the beautiful running trails in Kansas, I was finally obliged to cross the bridge over the Missouri River and see what those bushwhackers to the east had to offer a young runner in the Show Me State. After about a half-hour drive, I arrived at Smithville Lake, a large Corps of Engineer reservoir in lake country. There's a nice trail there, and I had a wonderful scenic run along the lake, beginning and ending at the municipal boat ramp. While I was stretching after the run, I noticed that a young KU student, proudly wearing, of course, his Jayhawk sweatshirt, had been stopped while pulling his fishing boat out of the lake by a game warden, who was, I might add, proudly wearing his Missouri Department of Natural Resources shirt. It appeared that the student had 2 complete ice chests full of fish in his boat. "Do you have a Missouri fishing license?" asked the warden, obviously a Mizzou grad, and clearly enjoying the fact that he appeared to have caught a Jayhawk on the wrong side of the river and the wrong side of the law. "No, sir," replied the student, but being a characteristically quick-witted KU student, he immediately went on the offense. "I don't have a Missouri fishing license because the fish in these coolers are my pet fish from Kansas," he said. And he showed the warden a valid Kansas fishing license. "You see," continued the student, "on the weekends I take my pet fish out of Clinton Lake in Kansas, and I travel to the beautiful lakes of Missouri where I allow my fish to gain an appreciation for the rich and wonderful Missouri fish culture by swimming around with them for the day. Then, when it's time to return to Kansas, all I do is whistle, and my pet fish jump right back into the ice chests, and I take them back to their home in Clinton Lake, where they then share with their Kansas fish friends what they've learned here in Missouri." Well, of course, the warden rolled his eyes and, with a voice heavy with sarcasm, responded, "Right, Look," he said, "I may have been born on a Sunday, but it wasn't last Sunday. That's a bunch of hooey. Fish can't do that." The KU student looked shocked that the warden didn't believe him, and with great sincerity he replied, "But warden, it's the truth. In fact, I'll show you how it works." "Okay," said the warden, "this I've got to see." So the resourceful Jayhawk poured the fish into Smithville Lake and stood and watched and waited. After several minutes, the warden turned to him and said, "Well?" "Well, what?" asked the KU student. "When are you going to call them back?" demanded the warden. "Call who back?" asked the student. "Your culturally aware Kansas fish," yelled the game warden. "What fish?" asked the student innocently. Well, it is a great pleasure to be at KU this evening, to be able to share a few thoughts. Well, thank you for that. That's the first time I used that fish joke, and my speechwriter was sweating bullets over that one, I want you to know. Material had been a bit thin of late, so... but it is great to be with you all tonight. But before I begin, sincere thanks are in order as well. I do want to thank you, Chancellor Hemingway, for those kind words and to tell you what a pleasure it is to follow you at the podium this evening. Your leadership here has helped KU solidify its reputation as one of our nation's premier academic institutions. Indeed, that reputation, yes, it would be. That reputation is one of which all members of this great university should be proud. And beyond that, we are very grateful to you for the wonderful partnership that has been established between various elements of KU and the City of Lawrence, I might add, and the Command and General Staff College and the other activities at Fort Leavenworth. Our officers have benefited enormously from our exchanges, the academic opportunities you've made available, and the instruction by members of your faculty. And this has helped us considerably as we strive to develop multi-skilled, culturally aware leaders who can guide our soldiers in the challenging environments in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere around the world. It's also great to see here tonight a true champion of the U.S. military and a former member of it, of the Army, Congressman Dennis Moore. Where are you, sir? Thank you for being here. I think you all know he has been a consistent advocate for our soldiers and their families. He has visited our troopers wherever they're deployed, including in Iraq, and he has helped the great state of Kansas in its truly bipartisan and successful effort to get the historic 1st Infantry Division back to Fort Riley, Kansas, where I think you've all heard their colors will once again be unfurled in early August. And I know that he, along with all true Kansans, will be proud to hear once again proclaimed on the parade fields of Fort Riley the motto of the Big Red One: no mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great, duty first. Hua. Bill Lacey, Director Lacey, thank you and everyone at the Dole Institute for hosting this evening's events. By all accounts, the Institute is very fortunate to have you at its helm, and I believe it would be very much in order were we to join again in applauding what you and your team are doing at this wonderful institution and the way in which you're doing it. Thank you. I do want to offer a special thank you to the faculty and staff members in attendance this evening. As everyone here appreciates, the strength of KU, what makes this university truly special, has always been professors who place great importance on teaching and advising their students, often at the expense of their own research writing and other pursuits, and staff members who truly go out of their way to help students too. It's a pleasure to have seen some of them earlier this evening in the reception and to see them in the auditorium this evening, and I'd ask that you all appropriately recognize them as well. I was told to note that these individuals clearly live and breathe the spirit of your university's famous Rock, Chalk, Jayhawk cheer, recognized by President Teddy Roosevelt, I'm told, as the greatest college cheer that he ever heard. And by the way, I also need to share with you that our technical staff at Leavenworth has indeed confirmed another bit of lore that was shared with me, that when you play the original Rah Rah Jayhawk KU cheer backwards, it does indeed reveal the hidden message, we're better than Mizzou. And I want to assure you that I, for one, have never doubted that for a moment, especially after that healthy 10-point win over the Tigers on the gridiron here in Lawrence last October. Now, finally, I'd like to thank the members of our military and especially the leadership and cadets from the ROTC programs who are here this evening. They are, as you all know, our nation's future military leaders, and it's great to see them. In fact, seeing them brings to mind a story from my own time as a young officer, not long after being commissioned as an infantry second lieutenant and shortly after reporting to my first unit, an airborne battalion in Italy. I was a brand new rifle platoon leader, and our outfit was on its first field exercise since I'd taken over. We'd had a great day, training well into the night before my platoon sergeant and I crawled into our sleeping bags in a tent made up of 2 shelter halves put together. I'd been asleep for an hour or so, really dead to the world, when my platoon sergeant, a wise old airborne ranger, elbowed me in the ribs and woke me up. "Sir," he said, "look up and tell me what you see." So I looked up into a beautiful night sky and replied, "I see 1,000,000 stars, platoon sergeant." "And what does that tell you, sir?" the platoon sergeant asked. I thought for a few moments, and wanting to impress my platoon sergeant, gave an answer that I was sure would be truly profound and keen, indicative of the keen intellect developed during my 4 years at West Point. "Well," I said, "astronomically, it tells me that there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Theologically, it tells me that God is great and that we are but small and insignificant. Meteorologically, it tells me that we're going to enjoy a beautiful day for training tomorrow." There was a long pause as my platoon sergeant considered my answer. After a while, I got impatient, and I finally asked him, "What does it tell you, platoon sergeant?" "Well, sir," he replied, "it tells me that somebody stole our tent." Well, I want to assure you I will not try to be too profound tonight. In fact, my focus is on Iraq, and in particular a number of observations that I took from my time there. As the Chancellor shared with you, returned from Iraq about 6 months ago after having served in that country the bulk of our first 2.5 years there, initially as a division commander of the wonderful 101st Airborne Division, then doing a several-week short-notice assessment of the Iraqi security forces in the spring of 2004, and then returning in early June 2004 for some 15 months as the head of the so-called train and equip missions on both the coalition and NATO side. And after my remarks, I'll be happy to answer a few questions, and if you like, talk briefly about the current status of the Iraqi security forces or how we're incorporating our lessons learned from Iraq and the U.S. Army or any other topic of interest. And here we go. So this is what I'd like to talk about. Well, let me just talk from right here then. And what I'll do is I'm going to share, again, 14 observations that are sort of a summation of, again, 2.5 years of experience over there. This does show, by the way, some interesting scenes from Iraq, and I'll highlight a few of them. These are from the mechanized police. This is from the Iraqi mechanized division. That is their counter-terrorist force, some police training, riot control training, and then some Iraqi police right there. Next slide, please. The first lesson that we took from Iraq was that good old Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, had it right when he had this quote right here, and I guess I'll read it so that those in the back know what it says. And it does say, "Do not try to do too much with your own hands. It is their war, and you are to help them, not win it for them." And T.E. Lawrence wrote that back in 1917 after he had had his own experience in an earlier train and equip mission with Arabs out in the desert. We tried to live this, frankly, and in fact, those of you who followed what the 101st did in northern Iraq, we immediately figured out that we needed some help. We had a very, very heavy rucksack. We needed people who knew the country, who knew the area in which we were operating, needed people who knew how the country used to function so that we could try to get it functioning again in a reasonable way, and that help came from Iraqis. And we sought it out very early, and we indeed tried to help them guide the process of picking leaders, and then we sought to help them rather than doing things for them whenever we had the option. It worked pretty well. We were able to get an interim province council, an interim governor in place early in May of 2003, and we found enormous assistance from them. And by the way, it was multi-ethnic, it was representative of the people in that particular region, and they very much were helping carry that particular rucksack that we had at that time. Next slide, please. Our second observation, our second lesson. Armies of liberation in places like we were operating have half-lives. The point here is that although we were in fact greeted initially with great appreciation, indeed applause, particularly of course in the Shia areas, but also in the area where we were operating initially in the north, the Sunni Arab area, we came to quickly recognize that there were extraordinarily high expectations on the part of the Iraqi people, and that we were flat out operating in a different culture that has different values, and we are Americans and they are Arabs of different ethnic groups. And inevitably, over time, the combination of their high expectations and just the day-to-day operations would mean that sooner or later, what was initially an army of liberation would come to be seen by some, at least, as an army of occupation. So the idea here was that we needed to get a quick start. And again, in the 101st, we very much took this to heart, and we did everything that we could to get it going as quickly as I could. As I mentioned, running the province caucuses that produced this interim government by 5 May of 2004. It is indeed a race against the clock. But you have to be honest with yourself and recognize that the conduct of your operations, again, the desires of the Iraqi people, you know, they used to come up to me and they would say, "General," we called it the man on the moon challenge. "General, you Americans could take down Saddam in 3 weeks, you could put a man on the moon. Why can't you just give me drinking water?" Well, and the truth is, I wanted to say, because it's harder than putting a man on the moon, darn it, but, you know, that's not the right answer, and we would do the best we could. We continually did that. But again, we needed to realize that, again, like in number one, the sooner we got them helping themselves, and number two, the sooner they could truly take it over, of course, the better off it would be. Needless to say, the insurgents did not want that to happen. They have continually tried to disrupt that progress throughout time. But this is a big-time lesson, and we need to remember that one in future. I will tell you, by the way, that it is different in Afghanistan. And Secretary Rumsfeld asked me to come home through Afghanistan when I did come home last fall to do an assessment of the training and equipping and operations of the Afghan security forces. And in fact, in Afghanistan, the people there, very much lower expectations. They had been downtrodden and war-ridden for so many decades, not just so many years, that they were grateful for anything that was done for them. And it is a different situation. The half-life there was much, much longer than it is in many places in Iraq. Next slide. Now, when you're doing an operation like this, we reached a point where, in truth, money became more important than ammunition. In fact, Ambassador Bremer came up to Mosul, where we had deployed somewhat unexpectedly to us around the 22nd of April 2003. He sat down with us. We had a terrific day. He met the interim governor, province council, walked around the streets and everything else, met the Iraqi people. And before he headed back down to Baghdad, we sat for a minute by ourselves, and he said, "General, what can I do for you?" And I said, "Ambassador, what you can do is get us some money. What we need, money is ammunition in this fight at this point in time." And I said, "In fact, Ambassador, you know, when we were doing the fight to Baghdad, I could launch a $500,000 missile downrange. An Army tactical missile goes about 150 kilometers or so, 100 miles. We had Apache helicopters that were out there directing these things in, and we'd find big enemy targets and we'd launch those. I said, in fact, we fired 113 of these over $500,000 missiles. Nobody double-checked us. Nobody asked us to verify anything, turn in any receipts or anything else like that. In fact, they didn't even authenticate the radio call. So I said, you know, this is what we need to try to get, this kind of streamlined access to money. And in fact, to his credit, he went back to Baghdad, took the 800 or million or 850 million or so that had been captured by U.S. soldiers from Saddam's old hideouts, and then did turn that into money that we were able to use in something called the Commander's Emergency Reconstruction Program. And that money served us very, very well. All the way up till about September, October, in fact, and then Congress came in and they provided appropriated funds to supplement that, and then carried us on through, and has continued to carry us on through ever since. Small amounts of money, hugely, hugely important to us. We had about $53.6 million during the course of our 8 months in the 101st up in northern Iraq, with which we did over 5,000 small projects. You can do the math. That obviously equals, you know, less than $10,000 a piece. You could do a small school for about $8,000 at that time. You could do small water projects. You could do all kinds of things, equip their security forces, rebuild training locations, rebuild border forts. We got cement factories going, water treatment plants, oil industry pumping, believe it or not, and everything else. So hugely important. The other key lesson takeaway was that you have to get that money into the hands of those who have the capability and, even more importantly, the capacity. It's not enough just to be able to do something with it. You have to do a lot with it. You have to have a lot of capacity, in other words. We were fortunate at that time in the 101st to have an enormous amount of capacity. Our division alone, which was probably the smallest of the 3 or 4 divisions at that time as an overall task force, had 250 helicopters. It had probably 6,000 trucks. It had water purification units. It had logistics elements. It had well drillers. It had military police that could train police. It had military police that could train corrections officers. It had engineers, 4 battalions. It had other engineers that could do assessment, design, contracting, and QA/QC. The list went on and on. We were a small microcosm of society, which is what a division is, with satellite communications and everything else. And we had enormous capacity. And once we were able to get that money into our hands, it helped enormously. And it's a big lesson for all of our future missions. We did, in fact, even did private investment deals. This was a $17 million deal. We brought in a smart Princeton PhD from West Point that helped us put that together with our operational lawyers. By the way, lawyers are awesome in this kind of thing. I'll never say anything. No lawyer jokes in my presence. We had 28 operational lawyers with the 101st in northern Iraq, and they were worth their weight in gold because they can solve problems. I talked earlier about how we reopened the border with Syria. We did it legally in accordance with UN Security Council resolutions. This is well before the CPA was established and Ambassador Bremer was even in country, and they enabled us to do it legally because they knew how to carry out that kind of mission. Next slide. Now, I mentioned that the Army of Liberation has a half-life. You can extend the half-life. And a way to extend the half-life, of course, is by doing good deeds for deserving Iraqis in this case. And we sought to do an awful lot of those. In fact, we did have a small business program where we fronted money for small businesses through Iraqis, by the way. We had a very good Iraqi business professor that was set up to do that. The key, though, was as we looked at our initiatives, policies, and programs, to ensure that they would produce more Iraqis with a stake in the success of the new Iraq than we had prior to the start of that particular initiative, policy, or program. This was a key litmus test as we approached each of the decisions that we made. And in fact, that's inside of a major hydroelectric dam that produced some 700 megawatts of electricity a day for those of you who are in that business. That is a great deal of electricity, and I dare say it would run a good bit of western Kansas. Next slide, please. We also then had an operational test that we used to ask before every operation. We would say, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by the way it's conducted? The idea behind this was that we wanted to end each day with fewer enemies than we had when the day started, if possible. Now, it wasn't always possible, didn't always work out that way, but that's the theory. And so therefore we had this test. And what this led us to, for all the good future Army lieutenants back there, is that we tried to do targeted operations as opposed to big sweeps, where you have very precise intelligence, you know specifically where you're going, you know what the door looks like, you have a 10-digit grid for it, with a GPS, you have a photo, you know the description of the individual you're trying to apprehend, and oh, by the way, most of the times you could get them without blowing the door down. You just got them by a knock on the door with a large force around it. We did, for example, in a single night in Iraq, just in Mosul, in fact, 35 simultaneous targets, and we got 23 of the ones that we were after. Now, that is not to say there are not times when it is worth whatever it takes to get the people you're after. And we have this up there as an example because we considered doing whatever it took when we had to go get Uday and Qusay, Saddam's two sons. They were number 2 and 3 on the blacklist. We had intelligence come in. We had it. Then we confirmed, yep, they're there when they shot at us. So this is not one where we're going to knock on the door. We did offer them a chance to surrender. We had a lot of our very finest special mission unit. You know who those guys are. They joined up with us. Twice tried to take them by going into the house, had 3 of our soldiers wounded, actually 2 special mission unit, 1 of ours, and then we decided that we were going to take other means to kill them. In the end, we did not, though, drop a bomb. We didn't have to use close air support or anything like that. We had anti-tank missiles, and we flew 17 of those right into that house, and it did literally kill Uday, Qusay, and the bodyguard, and then the other was killed when they entered the house. We immediately then brought in what we called Task Force Neighborhood. This is a special group made up of lawyers, people that could carry money, could issue contracts, military police, civil affairs, and others to canvass the neighborhood, explain what we'd done, why we did it, hold the crowd at bay, and then to pay for any damage that was done to anybody's lawn, because as you would imagine, by the time this thing was over, we had probably 2 battalions of soldiers surrounding us to make sure they couldn't get out, plus all the special mission guys, plus all the 3-lettered intelligence agency people, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a case where we were willing to do more, but in the end, I think we did it in a way that did not lose the neighborhood. In fact, as I said, we re-landscaped half of the neighborhood, I think, at our expense. And then we also dismantled the entire house and carried the whole thing away completely so that there was absolutely no sign of that left at all. Next slide. I talked about the need for precision operations whenever you can possibly do them. The key is intelligence. Intelligence, 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 like location, 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 and real estate, is the absolute be-all and end-all for when it comes to conducting operations in a counterinsurgency environment if you want to take more bad guys off the street than you create by the way you do the operation. This requires pulling all intelligence agencies together. It requires, frankly, sometimes forcing everyone to work together. Non-cooperation is not an option, and you have to do a little bit of leaning on people to do that. That's all very possible. Get it out of the way up front, and then everybody makes way together. We were fortunate to be able to do that. As I mentioned, that enabled us to do as many, as I said, 35 targets in a single night. Another time we did 27 when things were turning difficult for us during Ramadan in 2003, but that enabled us to get it back under control and then to continue the rebuilding effort and so forth. Next slide. We had lots of civil affairs up there. In fact, we had 2 battalions, which is more than I've ever seen in one place at one time. Just tremendous national assets, these young soldiers that can work across the spectrum in a society, rebuild anything you've got out there. The problem is there's only handsful of them for each different segment of that particular economy or society. And so a story illustrates that. We sat down again with the interim province council there. We had the police back on the street. We had security going pretty well. And said, okay, what's your next priority? What's next on your list? And they said, well, we want you to reopen the University of Mosul. And by the way, the University of Mosul is a phenomenal institution. It is actually bigger, with all due respect, Chancellor, than KU. It was about 35,000 students, and it had a staff that's even bigger. Of course, you know, they always have big staffs over there, about 4,000. His mouth is watering. But enormous, and they were very, very proud of Mosul University. They put a great premium on higher education in that area of Iraq. So they wanted to get that reopened. So I said, well, what's the problem? They said, well, you know, I guess you haven't seen it lately, but it's been heavily looted like every other government building, unfortunately, up in the north before we got up there. So I said, okay, great, I'll go over there, take a look around, drive over. I went over, met the chancellor. He had about 18 or 19 colleges. Each has a dean. The chancellor is late 60s, has a PhD from the UK. All his deans, Western-educated PhDs. This is a credible place. So anyway, I went on a tour with him, and it was unbelievable. You know, everything had been stripped. There was nothing left. He had about 100 total structures, major structures, no computers left, no library left, no anything at all, not a stick of furniture. And they said he wanted to finish the school year, and that was what the province council wanted as well. It's very important, not only symbolically but substantively to them, that their students, their sons and daughters in Mosul, didn't waste that particular school year. So we sat down with him and figured out this is going to be a big task. My next stop was the Civil Affairs Battalion. I went over and visited him, said, okay, Colonel, what do you got? He said, oh, sir, we got this great education team. You know, I got this young captain, taught elementary school one time, got a couple sergeants. He had a couple other folks that drive the vehicles. You know, we're good to go. I said, have you seen Mosul University lately? He said, well, I've never been over there, no, but I mean, you know, it can't be all that big. I said, okay, right. So I said, let me go back to the command post and give this to the designated thinkers back there and see what they come up with. So we went back and thought it over, and we ended up calling up one of our aviation brigades, and I told him, hey, congratulations, Colonel, you won the lottery, you get to rebuild Mosul University. And he did. And, you know, it's amazing what happens when you give a commander who has a staff and has an organization with, you know, 100 helicopters and trucks and contractors and engineers and lawyers and you name it, signal officers. And, oh, by the way, as always, American ingenuity. Turned out one of these pilots was a former network systems engineer, and he rewired the whole place. And another guy, believe it or not, was a part-time plumber, and, you know, he fixed all that stuff. I mean, it just went on and on. And we got all the Iraqis working for us, too, of course, because we got a little bit of Ambassador Bremer's money then. And lo and behold, about 3-4 weeks later, we actually had classes going again. Yeah, it was 100 degrees in the classroom, but they were in there, and it got going. And then we were able, a month and a half later, to conduct the final exams. Yep, it was about a month late, but they did it. And it was one of the few places in Iraq that year that completed the school year. They were very, very proud of it. What that taught us, though, was that as great as our civil affairs are, they're not enough. Everybody had to do nation building. And so we bit the bullet, and everybody did it. And it was a big decision early on because, you know, we were all sort of hesitating. We were looking for that guy that we were going to lateral the football to, and it looked like we were going to hang on to it for a while. So we did. I will not say that every single great HUA infantry battalion commander took to this immediately. There were some that said, you know, I want to go on raids. I want to do the He-Man stuff at night and lead with my soldiers, and guys are getting shot at out there. And so we had to convince a few of them, you know, I want to come down and confirm your excellence in nation building in about 3 days, and then they get serious about it. And there were one or two who said, do you ever want to command anything again? And he said, yes, sir. I said, good. Start commanding the delivery of air conditioners to the mosque here. And they got after it. So... But no, in all seriousness, you know, once guys got the mission, once they understood what they needed to do, they got after it. But everybody had to do it. Next slide. We also learned that it was not enough just to build units. We picked up, we got the train and equip mission going. We got these battalions and brigades and divisions out there. They started to fight. If somebody wants to get into it later, I'll mention, you know, there's some 70 Iraqi battalions that are now in the lead. I think about 59 or 60 of them own their own combat battalions now, own their own area of responsibility, which is an incredible growth in their capability over the course of the last 18 months or so. But anyway, this started going and started getting some momentum. Don't think anything of this was easy. And it is not easy, and it's very, very hard, and it's the toughest thing you can ever imagine doing with every imaginable challenge. But, you know, it's coming along. And we discovered, though, that we have got to get the ministry fixed. We have got to get the logistics fixed. We've got to get a depot system. We have to get branch schools. We have to get a military academy, staff colleges. Now, some of this was pretty obvious from the get-go, but I'll tell you that I didn't realize for a few months, for example, that there were not even any personnel policies left. So we needed to help them write personnel policies. You know, who gets to pick a commander? Well, gee, back in the old days, I used to pick my brother-in-law. Well, you know, it's not that way anymore. Who gets to sign contracts? You, that's a great one. You know, this is the place that invented the word bakshish. So anyway, there was no end of challenges. And, but over time, the building of the institutions has become hugely important. And in fact, the ministries of Interior and Defense generally have developed reasonably well. Lots and lots of challenges. And until they get the new government in place, get the new ministers in place, and can start from there, of course, it's not going to totally take off. But you've got to have advisors in the institutions as well as in the units. This is really important now, as well as the congressman knows, that we get them into the other ministries too. Iraq is making money. I think they've made $7 billion already just on oil exports this year alone. But they've got to get that money back into the country. It funnels through a bank in New York, of all things. Then it goes back into cash, eventually, into the Ministry of Finance, and then makes its way out to these other ministries in what is still a very centrally planned economy. The ministries are the key to that money working for the Iraqi people, and so therefore they've got to get those other ministries stood up as well. And Ambassador Khalilzad and General Casey are very committed to that, as you would imagine. Next slide. Another very obvious one. You know, anybody that's studied any counterinsurgency knows that this is much more than just military operations. In fact, some of the classical works, like Galula, famous author on counterinsurgency, one of the key books that we read at the Command and General Staff College, estimates, in fact, that a good counterinsurgency is only about 20% military and about 80% political. You can argue over the mix, but there's no question but that it is much, much more than just military. In fact, I think everybody recognizes right now that the key to success in Iraq right now, in fact, is forming a government. It has to be of sufficient national unity, that it'll hold the country together. They then have to get ministers in place, build some form of civil service over there and governmental capability and capacity, just as I discussed capacity earlier, provincial governors and so forth. It is hugely important that they make that step, and of course that is what Ambassador Khalilzad and the others have been working so very, very hard. But it's more than that. It's about employment. It is about basic service. It's about diplomatic initiatives. Hey, Syria, how about controlling your side of the border? Hey, Iran, how about stopping the infiltration from your side? And so on and so forth. And again, very important to keep that in mind. Next slide. Cultural awareness is something that we clearly have taken away as of enormous importance. We have started much, much more cultural awareness training throughout our military system, language training and all the rest of that. If you go to the National Training Center out in the Mojave Desert, where we do the mission rehearsal exercises, the last thing a brigade does before it deploys to Iraq, they actually will confront 300 different Iraqi role players, some 1,500 U.S. soldiers who hold onto your hat. They get to grow beards and act like insurgents. They replicate everything that you find in Iraq, or we have an Afghan scenario as well with Afghan role players. And they are true Afghans. They may live in Los Angeles, but they still very much can act out that role. It is crucially important that when our soldiers arrive in a foreign country that they do understand the dynamics of that culture. They understand who is who, understand the tribes, the political groupings, the ethnic groups, the social elements, and how they all relate with one another. Understand something about the governmental structures and processes and how the country is run. Understand who the local and national leaders are. Understand some of their history, some of their religion, and some of the language. All very, very important. It's a lesson that we've learned big time over there, and it's one that we are very much inculcating in our various schools and our training. I can tell you can't see these. These are photos actually from the provincial council meetings, and I still can't look at those to this day without remembering precisely who each of those individuals is, what tribe he is from, what his relationship was with others, where he would stand on a particular issue, because you've got to know that when you enter into these kinds of meetings with them. And you got to do a lot of this right here, which is sitting on a floor with in that case, a bunch of province tribal chiefs and the deputy governor of that particular province. Next slide. I mentioned this about the success depending on local leaders. I'll reiterate that again. But it's more than just the obvious ones. It's more than just the national leaders. Certainly they've got to get this government of national unity, which does include, of course, a prime minister and the ministers of the key ministries. But beyond that, they've got to get the provincial politics sorted out and it can't be winner takes all in all those different provinces. And of course, we've got to keep building the leaders in the security forces so that they are like the leaders that we try to develop in our own military system, which look to the needs of their soldiers first, and then to their own needs, who will lead from the front courageously and set the kind of example that they need for soldiers who are in combat. Next slide. We spend a lot of time thinking about individuals called the strategic corporals or the strategic lieutenants. These are what those ROTC students will be out there in a couple of years. They're young leaders. They're the ones who are on a hasty cordon outside a particular operation, a hasty traffic control point. They're the ones who are there with their sergeants and their corporals who are having to make life or death decisions in the blink of an eye in the most challenging environment you can ever imagine. When someone comes up to you and could be a suicide vest bomber, or any vehicle that approaches you could be a suicide car bomb, you cannot imagine the pressure on our young soldiers. And they are handling it well, but it is very, very tough for them. What we have to do as leaders is help them, first of all, by preparing them for the situations in which they're going to find themselves in our training, and we do indeed replicate that as well as we can at these combat training centers, at our post camps and stations. And then also we have to help them shape the situation so that there's something that will stop a car and clearly identify the checkpoint as a coalition checkpoint so that they will in fact stop and not blow through it and not have to be stopped this way with bullets through a windshield by a soldier who is understandably on a hair trigger. Next slide. We talk a lot about what it takes to develop leaders who can be successful in this environment. It does take, as I mentioned, cultural and some language, survival language capability, but it also takes something that America does seem to have in spades oftentimes, and that is young men and women who are flexible and adaptable, who can take on situations for which they may not have been trained at all. We had people, I had a captain who was named Mr. Oil. He had to solve all the oil problems in western Nineveh province, and by God he did. I mean, he even negotiated a deal with Syria where we got 53 megawatts of electricity from them for some 5,000 barrels of oil a day. That type of young man, young woman is of enormous importance, and we do have to continually challenge ourselves to say, how can we do this better? What else can we do at Fort Leavenworth? Why is this partnership with KU so important? To get our students out of their intellectual comfort zone. You know, what was it helped you, Petraeus, to confront those? I'll tell you what it was. It was civilian graduate school, where you are an army of one, I'll tell you. You know, as people are challenging you, and you go, you know, you debate the head of the German Greens Party or something like this. So all of this, very, very helpful and very, very important as we move forward. Next slide, please. Finally, the most important lesson that we continually took from Iraq was the importance of senior commanders setting the right tone. You have to get that tone right. There are some cases where we clearly did not. We've made our share of mistakes over there. Abu Ghraib is nothing but an absolute mistake and a tragedy. And it is a case where leaders at various levels did not get the right ethical tone. This is an incredibly difficult environment. I'll never forget the story of one individual, a battalion commander, a true hero in football at West Point, a wishbone quarterback, gained 1,000 yards with a flak vest his senior year. I watched him. I was in the stands, took Army to probably the last bowl game that we've won. He was on the battlefield, a real heroic leader out there in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, was a battalion commander in Iraq, won the Bronze Star for valor over there. And then something happened, and it just aided his unit. And the frustration gripped them. They got terribly upset with some of the locals who were clearly not supporting their efforts, even though our soldiers were dying for it. And at the wrong point, at the absolute wrong time, gave the wrong body language, and lo and behold, one thing leads to another, and there are Iraqis being forced to jump into a canal, one of whom drowned. That ends somebody's career. And it's a tragedy for all involved. And that's the kind of thing, again, that we've got to work on. We've got to get the right tone. We've got to get the right mix. And this mix changes from time to time of what we call kinetic or lethal and non-kinetic or non-lethal. And it does change. The 101st was very, very non-lethal for a good 4 or 5 months. Ramadan was very tough. We became much more lethal, but targeted lethal as much as possible. got it under control, and then get much more emphasis again on the non-lethal. Commanders get paid to make this kind of adjustment and to find the right mix for their particular unit, and then to communicate that down through their soldiers, through their subordinate leaders, to make sure that the troopers on the ground understand what it is that they're trying to accomplish and bring that right mix to it. Next slide, please. Well, those are 14 observations from my time in Iraq. They are admittedly sort of big picture ones. We've got lots of others on lots of other different topics, all the way down to tactics and techniques and procedures on up to even more strategic issues. But I thought they might be of interest to you this evening. And what I would do now is welcome your questions, after which I'll have a few following concluding comments. Thank you.
Microphones, raise your hand and we'll get to you.
Is this on? Okay. Sir, I don't want you to comment about what these retired generals have to say. I don't want you to do that.
Oh, I'm happy to comment about it. I'm up front with American people.
All right, sir. What I'd like to know is, it seems like a major theme is the fact that we got rid of the infrastructure, military and police, and we started from zero and had to build up. Now, is that true, or did this happen this way, or?
Yeah, we sure didn't get rid of it. Tragically, I mean, we certainly did do some precision bombing. And I will tell you that before every city that we took down, if you will, when we were in the fighting mode with the 101st Airborne Division, we liberated, for example, the city of Najaf, the holiest city in all of Iraqi Shi'ism. When we did that, before that, we would employ precision munitions each night, typically for 2 nights, and we would knock out every one of the Army barracks in that particular location, the Ba'ath Party headquarters, and then the Fedayeen, which is one of their paramilitary organization, any of their locations that we knew about. But these were very precisions. There were typically no more than 5 or 6 targets within a given city. We did the same thing in Karbala and Hilla. Most of the rest of it we did not. What caused the damage was this horrible looting that took place. And it truly, I think, you know, this was an orgy of looting that the Iraqi people and all of the military, before they left their posts, because the entire military did disintegrate at some point, and they took a lot of it with them, tragically. We tried to stop what we could, but this is a massive effort. We would be fighting, for example, we were fighting in the biblical city of Babylon. Hilla is the name of the city, the capital of Babel province. And as we were fighting our way into the southern part of the city, the military barracks, which was just to the north of that front line, was already actually looted before we'd ever even entered the city. And that was the story throughout Iraq. We eventually, as I mentioned, went up north to Mosul and took over the whole northern part of the country. A distance that stretched from east to west was the distance of Washington to New York, and from Boston to New York from south to north, to give you a sense of the size of that area that we covered. And before we got up there, again, it was just absolute chaos because there were no U.S. forces of any size whatsoever up there. There were a handful of special forces and a very small contingent of Marines that were very, very challenged downtown Mosul, and it actually had to pull back out to the airfield by the time that we arrived. So that's number one. I will tell you that on the outspoken retired senior officers that I am wrestling with that one, candidly, and I'll be open and honest with you. Clearly there's an issue of free speech, which they fought in combat as well as all the rest of us to preserve for our country. They're private citizens. But on the other hand, tugging the other way is the issue of civilian control of the military, which is something that we all very much cherish and all of America should celebrate, and is very, very important. And beyond that, I will tell you that for what it's worth, I briefed Secretary Rumsfeld a number of times in my last job, and it's a little bit like briefing a very tough professor at a very first-rate university doing an oral exam. And if you're not on a firm foundation, if you don't have a grip of your facts, he will do what a good, aggressive assistant professor, by the way. It's always the assistant professors. They're on the rise up. They want to make a name for themselves. But having gone through this at, you know, at another university, I'll tell you that, I mean, I felt like that a couple of times. But if you were on the firm foundation, if your facts were right, and if you lean back into them, then, you know, I mean, I came back in June of 2004 and did a weekly video teleconference with him for a week, or for an hour each week. And at the end of that, he gave us $1.8 billion and the additional 500 or so some odd soldiers that we needed for our mission at that time. I don't know what happened in 2002 and 2003. I obviously wasn't at that level at that time. I certainly wasn't in the circles talking about the numbers and all the rest of that. So I'll leave that to them. But I'm a little bit torn over this thing, and I would not ever want to see the military be politicized, and I would not want to see a situation in which senior generals were chosen on the basis of the expectation that they'd keep their mouth shut in retirement, as opposed to that they would provide the best military advice that would be possibly available. So it's a tough one. This is, as with a lot of really tough issues, it's not open and shut, but I'm not that comfortable with it, frankly.
We have a question from an assistant professor in the front row here.
Are you going to interrogate me?
I will not grill you really very hard. But I have just two quick questions.
Sure.
One is, I'm hearing...
Do you allow two, actually, or is it just one?
Wee ones? I am hearing and reading more about the Interior Ministry forces, which is to say the police department,
right,
which is mostly dominated by Shias, taking action against Sunni Iraqis. This is particularly of concern to me, since we are providing them with most of their equipment. I'm wondering what, if anything, we're doing right now to gain control of those forces. That's
a great question. Okay, let me ask that one first. Answer that one first, if I could. First of all, when we have had those kind of issues, when I was in that job, I went to the minister, who is still the same minister, by the way, and I said, Minister, I have just withdrawn support today for the major crimes unit in Baghdad, which had been found to be mistreating prisoners. And that means we've stopped construction, I've stopped equipment delivery, no more food, no more nothing. That's it. And oh, by the way, I made him walk out past the 3 armored cars that I was going to give him at the meeting today because they didn't deserve them. And he said, fine. And he said, what do you want me to do? I said, I want you to throw this guy in jail and I want you to fire this guy. And he did. Now, I'm not saying it's always that easy, because part of the problem is that they have literally been challenged to figure out who in the world is doing some of the extracurricular activities. We have had more challenges with the police for a variety of reasons. By the way, they are not completely Shia by any means. In fact, the original minister was actually a Sunni Arab. It is a Shia right now, when they switched the Minister of Defense from Shia to Sunni. The senior officer of the Iraqi National Police, the police commandos, the public order battalions, the ones that are most, we think, possibly the ones involved in extracurricular activities, is a Sunni Arab. In fact, he is the cousin, by the way, of the previous minister. You know, this is Iraq. So now, having said that, they are clearly predominantly Shia, in part because the Sunni Arabs did themselves in when they didn't vote in 30 January of 2005, and then when they really intimidated their own young men from going into the police or military, and also blew up army recruiting stations and so forth. Now, they sorted themselves through that in the spring of 2005, recognized what a stupid move that was. Let us rebuild them. Let us start recruiting again. In fact, the imams then issued a fatwa that said it's the duty of young Sunni Arab males to join the security forces. But they had done damage by that point in time, and it's very difficult to undo it in a situation like that. So what do? We go in and we tell the minister, you know, what we're hearing, this is unacceptable. You need to do the additional training. We're going to have our advisors do courses with your battalions and so forth. We did have a problem where we did not have full coverage of advisors, because they literally developed some units more quickly than we were able to get advisor teams over there for a period, and that did hurt. But we do now have advisor teams with every single one of the National Police battalions, and these are the ones of most concern, because they're the ones of the most capability. Now, ironically, they have been the most heroic as well. And you know, as is often the case in Iraq, there are often good news, bad news stories. A year ago, we started visiting congressional delegations, in fact, that we thought that we were reaching the point, because the political process was moving along and it was on track, we were reaching the point where Iraqis would be able to take this forward, and that's a pretty big deal. But I said there's some bad news, and that bad news is that they will have to take it forward at a certain point. And of course, we are at that point now, and it is very, very difficult for them to resolve who is going to be the prime minister, and that clearly at an impasse in that regard. So, you know, we are very concerned, and I was very concerned when I was there. I can assure you that my successor, Lieutenant General Marty Dempsey, who's a very good friend of mine, a classmate at West Point, and was a fellow division commander the first year in Iraq as well, and gets it, is very concerned about it. And they have, you know, we do take action when we can prove it. The problem is that what you get sometimes in the press is an awful lot of speculation. By the way, we had a wonderful one on Sunday. We were reading online, and somebody Googled something, and it came up. I hadn't realized it, but we are supposedly at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, are planning the second liberation of Baghdad. I'm not making this up. This is in the London Sunday Times. This is a reputable international newspaper, and they reported that by name Petraeus is helping plan the second liberation of Baghdad that will take place right after the new government is seated. Now, that was news to me, and I may not have complete control on everything at Fort Leavenworth, maybe a little bit like the Ministry of Interior in Iraq, but I didn't think that we were doing that at this time. And so, again, finding out what is actually going on sometimes is among the challenges. We did find that the Iraqi Highway Patrol was implicated in some of this stuff. They did not have as good an advisor coverage, and they actually have been dissolved. You know, again, if we can figure out who it is, what it is, and everything else, then we clearly take action, and they will take action as well. But it's a tough place to figure out precisely what's going on in sometimes. So, thanks. Yes, sir.
General, before the intervention of the United States in Iraq, the President asked Congress for a use of force resolution. And I, along with many other House members, I suppose all the House members, had 4 classified briefings. And I was absolutely convinced from the information I received in those briefings that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And as it turns out, after the fact, after the military intervention, after Saddam Hussein was captured, David Kaye, the chief weapons inspector of the United Nations, searched and searched and didn't find any. I don't fault President Bush for this because, frankly, our NATO allies had the same bad intelligence: France, Germany, Italy, UK. My question is, why did we have such bad intelligence? What's the reason for that? How do we protect against that in the future to make sure that never happens again?
Sir, first of all, I'll tell you that we were with you. I wouldn't have worn this, you know, head-to-toe mop suit, as they call it, the mission-oriented protective posture that had us in, you know, rubber boots and full body everything in 110 degrees, charging up hills with body armor and Kevlar helmet on top of that, if we didn't think that. Now, the reason, I think, is we literally did not have the penetration, obviously, in the country, didn't have the quality human intelligence, and obviously just didn't have the kind of insider knowledge that we really need to have. Now, as you well know, that is very, very difficult to obtain in a closed society, but it has to happen, and you know, we've got to do that better. And I think Ambassador Negroponte, who was the ambassador in Baghdad, as you'll recall, initially after transition of sovereignty in 2004 into early 2005, and is now the Director of National Intelligence, is absolutely determined to try to produce that, along with Porter Goss at the CIA. So.
What, from your point of view, are the pros and cons of the embedded reporters? And from your experience in the field, on which side do you come down? Right.
Well, I'm actually a big supporter of the embedded reporter thing. Although I didn't realize the one who was embedded with me was going to write a book in less than a year after the... I actually was very, very fortunate to have a great guy named Rick Atkinson who'd won, I think, 2 or 3 Pulitzer Prizes, but I First, let me start off, first of all, by saying a couple things. First of all, with respect to the press, all we can ask for the press is not that they be pro or con. We can ask them to be accurate, and if they're not accurate, we should raise Cain about it. I had actually a public affairs officer early on. He said, "Hey, General, I'm going to, tonight, this is when we were still in Kuwait, I'm going to start grading the press on whether they're positive or negative stories." And okay, great. And then I thought a little longer. I said, "No, stop. You're not going to do that. What you're going to do is grade the press again on is it accurate or isn't it inaccurate? If we crash a helicopter, it's a lousy story. That's a negative story. But if they report it accurately, they're doing their job. And we can't complain about that. So that's number one. Number two is I firmly believe that this is not my army or my brigade commander's army. This is your army. And it's your sons and daughters. It's the American people's sons and daughters who are serving in that army, and I think they have a right to know what's going on in that army, and I think the only way to provide that to them, in many cases when it's dicey, is to have embedded reporters. I mean, you can't have people just running around out there. You got enough problems on your hands trying to figure out who's who as it is. And I do feel that we have to be open in that regard, and we need to answer the press. And that sometimes, folks will say, "Oh, the guy's trying to get a headline." That's not it. But you got to tell the people, allow the people to see what their sons and daughters are doing. The embedded reporters do that, and they do that better than any other way that I know of. We did notice, candidly, as you got, through the first string went home, and then the second string was out there, and then the third string. And when you get to the really younger ones that are trying to win the Pulitzer in the first week, occasionally there's a little frustration, and they're reaching a little bit, and they're snapping at the first thing that somebody provides to them, and maybe not like the London Sunday Times reporter, who our PAO called today, by the way, and said, "Did you think that you might call to check that story with us before you publish this fairly significant report in the fairly significant international newspaper?" He said, "Well, I saw that you guys were working on a field manual on counterinsurgency, so I just sort of put two and two together," and you say, "Oh, man." So anyway, the downside with embedded reporters is, of course, they are always embedded. And like it or not, if you have a bad day and the embedded reporter is there, he will get it in all its glory. And so there are a few of those things that emerge every now and then. But I think that's a downside that is very much worth all the upsides. And I think, frankly, we've got to support that kind of endeavor. By the way, I will tell you that when there were inaccurate stories, we took people to task. I actually went to see the publisher of the Washington Post one time when I was home on leave, Donald Graham, over a story that I thought was accurate, but it was a total mischaracterization because of the fact that it took a single tiny little example and then slapped Mission Impossible on top of it based on that, on the front page of the Washington Post above the fold. And I said, "This just isn't right." He, by the way, is a Vietnam veteran and agreed. And so, again, they want to know when they are not accurate or not doing it right. In all honesty, the mainstream, I'm not talking about fringes or tabloids or whatever, but the mainstream want to do it right, and they take it seriously.
Sir, I was wondering if maybe you could tell us about some of the precautions and or extra training that cadets like us will be going through to make sure that the same mistakes aren't made again after the first 3 years of the war.
Well, I think one thing that you should do is certainly look at the professional journals that are out there. And I'm not trying to be a shill here for Military Review, which does happen to be published at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, is the best military journal out there. It's www. No, you can Google Military Review and it'll come up, and it actually has a number. By the way, it has an article based on this presentation right here, as a matter of fact. So I would go there and I would read those kinds of, there's a very good one in this particular issue that just came out, just hung on the internet, which talks about, for example, paradoxes of counterinsurgency operations, that sometimes the more you shoot, the less secure you are. The more you protect yourself, the less secure the area is. That type of thing that is important to understand. The fact is there's no list of rules, if you will. There's no true, in a sense, principles of war at the lowest levels that tell you exactly what to do that you can memorize. What you need to do is, this is a feel. It's how the area feels. It's how the situation feels. It's how the dynamics shape up in your mind as young leaders. And I can tell you there's nothing more important in that environment. And I'm not saying that battlefield, because in fact it's not just a battlefield. It is an operating environment, much of which the time you're there, you're not pulling triggers and you're doing a lot of other activities. And so you've got to understand the dynamics. You have to understand, as I mentioned, the culture. Some of the language is very helpful. In addition to all the usual skills that we want young lieutenants of whatever branch it may be that you'll be in to have mastered. And again, a lot of these are in these professional journals, and I do think that Military Review is a good one. Then depending on what branch you're going to go into, infantry, armor, whatever, they each have professional journals as well. Beyond that, for what it's worth, I think there's some other awfully important things. Actually, physical fitness is very important. You know, the old saying that it's hard to lead from the rear of the formation. You'd have to be fit. This is a very, very demanding environment. You know, soldiering is still an outdoor sport. And wearing body armor and Kevlar and carrying heavy ammunition and water and all the other equipment is not just tiring, it's crushing in 120-degree heat. And then you have to start to run in it and to fight in it and to dive on the ground and everything else. So it's an extraordinarily demanding physical endeavor. And you've got to be ready for that as well. So those would be the tidbits, I think, that I would offer to you. And people have captured them quite well. I'm sorry, one last one would be to go on to companycommander.com. This is a virtual community. We support it, by the way. We underwrite the cost of it from Fort Leavenworth. It's one of our projects. And a bunch of captains have all linked up virtually in the ether, in the internet, and they share tactics, techniques, and procedures. Some of them are actually in Iraq. Some are back in the States now, but they've all had experience, and they provide an awful lot of really good back and forth and dialogue. And remember, you know, again, there's no right answers to this kind of thing. This is a little bit like international relations theory. You know, the right answer is not to be found in this school of thought or this school of thought, but rather in the dialogue among them. And that's very true of what you'll be involved in. Yes, sir. Or who's? Sorry.
Good evening, sir. My name is Cadet Philip Hickson. My question concerns the recent rise in sectarian violence in Iraq. And specifically, based on your experience, would you feel that this is more being spurred by the insurgency in an attempt to foment chaos, or is this perhaps more an outgrowth of the struggle between Sunni and Shia for national political control?
It's actually both. Clearly, Sunni insurgents, for example, blew up the Gold Dome Mosque in Samarra that precipitated this recent outburst of violence. And despite the best efforts of the Shia religious leaders, Grand Ayatollah Sistani and others, to try to keep everybody calm, and they did succeed reasonably well, inevitably there has been some backlash from that, and that has continued back and forth, and it's a very troubling concern. I tend to think that most of the suicide bombings are still probably organized and trained and equipped and armed by the Sunni insurgents. But clearly there is a degree of very worrying sectarian violence carried out by Shia elements as well. And again, it's another reason why the Iraqis have got to get this government in place, because they do control, these political leaders control these militias by and large. It's not to say there's not a group of violent criminals out there that is doing some of this literally just for money. And they'll do it for the insurgents if they'll pay them. It's not to say the insurgents are not out there, the Saddamists, and then some of the flat-out true extremists, the religious extremists. But if you can get the government, if you can tamp down the militias, and if you can reach out to those sort of rational Sunni Arabs who will feel that they have a stake in the new Iraq if they're given a chance to be part of this solution instead of part of the problem, that has to be the way ahead, I think.
Is it not very important in a situation like this to have people who are trustworthy and accurate in the local language?
It is,
as
sir.
our own major superpower, what can we do to strengthen our knowledge of languages?
Well, that's a great question. And actually, of all things, the Chief of Staff of the Army asked the same thing of us at Fort Leavenworth, and we've actually been studying not just language, but cultural as well, cultural appreciation. For starters, we have greatly pumped up the numbers in the Defense Language Institute, which I oversee as one of the jobs that I've got. They're out in Monterey, California. I'd love to visit out there all the time. It is spectacular, and it is a true national asset. There are over 1,000 instructors out there alone. Gives you some sense of the magnitude of that effort. There's about 3,000 students, and about a third of them are studying Arabic right now, by the way. We also have created mobile training teams that are going around from our intelligence center and training the members of units that are going to deploy to Iraq or Afghanistan on the culture, and we give them a degree of what we call survival language, survival Arabic or survival Pashto. In addition to that, we have created a whole bunch of different high-tech training tools. There's something called Tactical Iraqi. It's a set of CDs. You plug them in the computer, and you can literally, it's interactive, and you can say to the computer, Salam Alaikum. By the way, we have an Iraqi in the audience. Where is he? Is he still back there? Stand up, Mustafa. He is a, come on up here. He is an interpreter. In fact, where's your Marine? Come on up here, Marine. No, I want to emphasize, this is a team, and this is how they operated. These two individuals were together in Iraq. The Marine has done 2 tours in Iraq. The last tour was in Fallujah. This is his interpreter right here. And this shows the kind of personal relationship. Hua. 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 In fact, we'll see how good my aide is. You think you can produce 2 coins there, aide man? Now, this does, it indicates the bond. They weren't here in the audience just for that, but thank you for asking that question. The bond with interpreters is very, very important. On the one hand, they are trusting us with their life. This is a risky business for them. And a number of them have actually had to immigrate to the United States. But on the other hand, we are trusting them enormously as well because as you say, the precision of what they interpret is absolutely vitally important that we get it right when we are doing these very sensitive negotiations. And this happens at low levels, by the way. The cadets out there as lieutenants and young captains will be diplomats, if you will. In uniform, certainly. They're not in the State Department, but they are still out there. They are the face of the coalition to those Iraqis. It doesn't make any difference to them that they're wearing a uniform or wearing a suit. If they have an American flag on their right sleeve, they are the coalition to them, and they're very, very important. And what we have here, again, is a team that is absolutely wonderful, and I want to give them my coin with my thanks. Hua.
Thanks a lot, sir. A first Army coin. Thank you, sir.
Shogren Jazil and Siddiqui. Mobruk. Actually, you pop up this slide, I'll just show you what we're doing at Fort Leavenworth for whatever it's worth in the Command and General Staff College. We have a pretty comprehensive approach across the board that just shows you, just for the students at Leavenworth, what we do is we say, okay, where are you going to deploy within 6 months? And then we determine they're going to study either Arabic if they're going to Iraq or Pashto if they go to Afghanistan, because the area in which our soldiers are operating is Pashto, not Dari. We then teach them what is out there and tell them about it and establish what are called distance learning classes for them with instructors out in Monterey Peninsula and then others that come to Fort Leavenworth. And we establish an account for them with an online software called Rosetta Stone, which again is an interactive program that is available in the Army Knowledge Online, which is one of our knowledge management tools. And then depending on whether they're going to have daily contact with locals or less contact with them, they either end up getting, as you can see here, some 56 hours of language plus additional culture classes, which, by the way, at Leavenworth are taught by 2 Iraqi students and 2 Afghan students out there. And then if lesser contact, then they'll get some 40 hours. So that just gives you a flavor at one institution, which does happen to be the one right down the road that we're doing right there, And again, we're doing similar activities throughout the Army. And we're also looking hard at what additional do we want out of young ROTC students, for example. Should they all be required to take at least 1 year worth of language and that type of thing? So, and I hope they're all back there saying, "Hua."
We're going to take 2 more questions.
Okay.
Yes, General, I was wondering, after the experience of Iraqi freedom and enduring freedom, if you could comment on how the employment of the reserve component played out and where you think it should go in the future.
First of all, I mean, in a word, I would say, A, that it was seamless, because once somebody puts on a uniform, you don't know whether they're reserve, Army Reserve, National Guard, or active, or whatever else it might be. Second, we have used the reserves very, very hard, and I'm talking about all reserve components now, National Guard as well as the U.S. Army Reserve and the other reserves and the other services, and they have performed magnificently. I think we have to be careful for a while here to let them have what we call some dwell time. We've actually used U.S. Army combat units in this, unlike Desert Storm. In fact, as you may know, there was an entire National Guard division with its division headquarters and its division commander that was deployed in Iraq for a full year tour right in the heart of the Sunni Triangle. His headquarters was in Tikrit, Saddam's hometown. And my entire headquarters, by and large, was from a reserve division of the U.S. Army Reserve called an Institutional Training Division, first the 98th and then the second year of the 80th. I will not say that there are not some challenges with that. It depends what the background of the individuals are. It depends how old they are. There's a little bit greater age. I'll tell you that they were terrific for my staff. A lot of them were good as advisors. Some of them probably we needed to look a little harder at the age piece. But we had some incredible talent in that group as well. Among them, for example, one of our deputy comptroller was a vice president with Goldman Sachs. He'd been doing reasonably well in Manhattan. He took a heck of a pay cut. But I will also tell you, and in fact, where's Mike from Benz? I did an event in New York, the Business Executives for National Security, and of all things, I ran into Bob Hormats, who is the vice chairman of Goldman Sachs, and I asked him whether or not he had taken care of this great lieutenant colonel, and he did. So he didn't lose any money either. So bottom line is that I think that they've done very, very well. I think, again, we have to be careful in the future not to go back to the well again too quickly in the case of those where we've drawn on it pretty heavily so far. Is that square with what your take would be? Okay, thanks. Are you in the reserves? Great. You've been called up? Give me your business card. We'll hook you up. We have a place for you.
I was just curious, what of these 14 lessons, which ones do we not learn in Vietnam?
I suspect that we've probably learned most of these, not just in Vietnam, but in countless others, other examples. I think that we have a pretty good history as a country of forgetting some of our history, frankly. We have some folks here from the Combat Studies Institute at Fort Leavenworth. One of their top professors recently published a very, very good little slim study of a number of previous cases in which we did counterinsurgency, nation building, these types of missions, and warned us that in fact we had learned lessons before, and clearly we had forgotten some of those lessons. For what it's worth, my dissertation is actually on the lessons of Vietnam for the United States on the use of force. And I can tell you that we learned a number of these, and again, in some cases, we probably wanted to forget them, perhaps, but I think we've rediscovered quite a few of them. And we are certainly going to endeavor this time to try not to let history repeat itself in that regard. In fact, I've asked that particular Combat Studies Institute researcher to present that paper at a symposium that we're going to do this summer. So, well, let me wrap this up if I could. I very much appreciate your patience tonight and the great questions and frankly just staying here through all this. I do want to offer a few final thoughts. Tom Brokaw, whose picture is around here from when he was with Senator Dole for the World War II memorial unveiling, and who you'll recall wrote The Greatest Generation. By the way, we have 2 members of The Greatest Generation here in the audience, and we thank them very much for their service. He spent some time with the 101st Airborne Division when we were deployed in northern Iraq. And before getting on a helicopter after a particularly good day, seeing the many, many tasks in which our troopers were engaged, he turned to me and said, "Surely these soldiers are the new greatest generation." I agreed with that then, and I still do. Repeatedly in Iraq, I saw the concept of the Army of One slogan played out as soldier after soldier proved to be the decisive individual in the performance of a particular task at a particular place on the battlefield. In fact, I often wondered, especially while observing soldiers rendering a final salute to a fallen comrade after a memorial ceremony, where does our country find such individuals, young men and women who, despite the personal flaws that we all have, serve so selflessly and in the face of enormous challenges repeatedly demonstrate impressive initiative, determination, innovativeness, and courage? I raise this today because as the discussion over Iraq continues, it is my hope that our country will never turn its back on those in uniform who have done what their country asked them to do, even though that duty required enormous sacrifice and entailed substantial hardship. And so today at this historic university and before this wonderful group of students, faculty, cadets, and community leaders, I want to express my hope that our country will never forget and never fail to honor the sacrifices of those who wear and have worn our country's uniform. Thank you very much.